I'm Warren Smith with World News Group. Ann Voskamp never expected to find her book 1,000 Gifts on the New York Times bestseller list for a solid year and counting. She describes herself as a simple farmer's wife from rural Ontario, Canada. Just plain Ann, she says, without even the decorative E at the end of her first name. But she does have a powerful personal story, which we'll hear in a minute, and she has a compelling, poetic writing style that's attracted fans all around the world. I flew to Detroit and drove 4 hours into Canada, where Ann lives with her husband and 6 children on a farm where the family raises pigs and grows corn and wheat and other crops. Behind the farmhouse is her writing cabin, built by her husband on the edge of a cornfield. We sat outside on a cool, windy day in June to talk about her book and her life on the farm.
Augustine says that all of us have one goal, and that is to search for joy, to find joy. And Lewis comes back and says that we needlessly disobey by ignoring the apostolic injunction to rejoice always. So how is we as Christians, how do we do that in the midst of daily duties, the stresses of everyday life? We talk about joy. Chesterton says that the Christians have this gigantic secret of joy. But do we really know what it's like to live that, really? And 1,000 Gifts unpacks that secret. Scripture says, in his presence is fullness of joy. And how do we come into his presence? Through those gates of thanksgiving. And that's my story.
1,000 Gifts, she told me, is about the sovereignty of God, the grace of God, and choosing to focus on the gifts of God, even in the midst of a fallen world.
My first memory is I was 4 years old. My 18-month-old sister was outside walking across our farmyard, and there was a delivery truck in our yard that didn't see her. And in front of my mother and I, the delivery truck ran over and crushed and killed my sister. That is my first memory. Those fears formed me. And I had an ulcer by the time I was 7. I was cutting myself by the time of my early teens. And by the time I was 19, I was diagnosed with agoraphobia. So for me, how do I find joy in the midst of a world where someone that you love can be killed right in front of you?
And it began with a list.
I had a friend who dared me to write out a list of 1,000 things that I loved. It was the beginning of Christmas season. You're writing out all these lists. When I started to write out, I realized, wait a second, what I'm really writing out is all of the gifts that God has given me, all of the things, the way God has loved me. Count the ways he loves me. And all of a sudden I realized I understood from Scripture who he was, but I started to see him and experience him in my everyday life. That his grace, he is this fountain of grace that just overflows. And it's not being grateful, yes, grateful for the gifts, but it's through the gifts to the giver that you begin to focus on.
I asked her to read some of the items on that original list.
This was November 13th, 2008. I find my joy in God alone, and I'm thankful for Levi's healing finger, for God's persevering ways, for the squeak of the rocking chair, for Shalom playing with the cat up front, for Malachi reading his book with his sunglasses on, the house filling with hope making that piano sing, my husband reading scripture after meals, books everywhere, everyone reading. You can see it's just moment by moment, leaving that out there on the counter, picking up a pen and thanking the Lord for moments that otherwise we get the pressures of life push on us and we just get so focused on the next thing. We're missing all of God's graces in the moment. And picking up that pen, Martin Luther says, Satan hates the use of pens. And when you pick up the pen and start to write down all of the ways God is present and blessing you, it turns your eyes to him all of the time. So you can see they were just mundane things, Warren.
Yeah, right. But they were mundane things that you became aware of.
Aware of that it might not have been at all. Chesterton talks about that every day is a miracle. Why was I given 2?
I asked Ann to tell me about some of the influences that turned her from the little girl shaped by tragedy into a wife, mother, and writer with a worldwide following. She told me that the tragedy of her sister's death made it difficult for her father in particular to believe in God. But a neighbor started a Good News Bible Club for children, It was there that Ann Voskamp became a Christian.
Scripture became my guidance through those years. I ended up marrying the youngest of 9 of that family that started the Good News Bible Club. And we now attend a little Bible chapel over here with about 175 people. Homeschool our 6 kids. Open up scripture every day after every meal. We always, if you're gonna eat food, my husband was raised Dutch, and Dutch tradition is you don't leave the table till you've read scripture. If you're gonna eat food, you're gonna eat spiritual food too.
I asked Ann if the success of her book has changed her lifestyle or intimidated her about writing a second book.
I guess I see it as his success, something he's done. I'm more intimidated by to sit down and write again. You're before a holy God, speaking of things of the Lord. That intimidates me. Try not to turn to the right nor to the left, just to keep my eyes on him. Books aren't formulas. There's not something that you can just grind out. They have to be lived. So I think now it's just to keep company with him, to stay steeped in scripture and write authentically out of my own life and my own wrestling, and his truth, laying that down on my life and seeing where I'm not, where I need to grow and what he has to work in me, and not think too much about anything else for it.
Ann says that despite her writing success, she remains committed to a rural farming lifestyle, in part because it provides her with daily reminders of the sovereignty and grace of God.
Our livelihood is made out of what comes out of those fields. We can't determine when we're going to plant a crop. We can't determine when we're going to harvest a crop. That's dependent on weather all summer long, whether it rains, whether we get enough heat units. Being farmers, it forces us to live constantly aware of the sovereignty of God, to live in a posture of bended knee. That there's years we get rain throughout the week. It starts to dry off on Friday. The perfect day to harvest your wheat crop is on a Sunday. But are you going to honor the Lord and keep that as a Sabbath? And we don't harvest that day. And to have that testimony in front of your children that, no, we're keeping the Sabbath day holy, even if it means we can't take our wheat crop off when we should take our wheat crop off, and the kids can hear combines going on farms around us, but we will keep the Lord first. So I think it's a privilege to be farmers and know that we are not in control at all. We have to be faithful to our part, but then it's a constant releasing, and the Lord determines the outcome.
Ann Voskamp and her entire family were gracious to this pushy American, a film crew, and all of our sometimes intrusive questions. But before we left, I had to know 2 things. First, if you've read 1,000 Gifts, you know that one of the chapters described a disease that was killing whole litters of her piglets. I had to know how things were now. She got a piglet out of the barn to show me that they were doing just fine. And finally, I wanted to ask her what advice she might have for others, young people especially, including her own children, who were growing up and seeking God's direction for living a satisfied life.
So, are you in prayer? To commit your ways unto the Lord. Elizabeth Elliot talks about doing the next thing. I think we're more faithful to doing the next thing. I didn't set out to write a New York Times bestseller or impact 500,000 people with a book at all. I was faithful to laundry and kids and small things. And that when we're faithful in the little things, then God can do bigger things. And I was writing out of my life. And I think we need to be faithful to what God's called us to, where we are right now. The book is about a dare to live fully right where you are. If God can take one broken, sinful, agoraphobic, fearful woman and do this, what could he do with you if you surrender your life to him?
Ann Voskamp's book continues to sit atop the New York Times bestseller list, and she is steadily, though she says not hurriedly, working on her next project. She told me that writing another book is important to her, but it's even more important to have a life that's worth writing about. Reporting for World News Group's New Christian Voices series, I'm Warren Smith.